Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the seventh masterclass organized by Francisco Marroquin's University Postgraduate School. Today we will have the great honor of listening to Dr. Samuel Gregg's lecture titled From Logos to Enlightenment and Back Again. For as long as I have known Dr. Gregg, he has been talking about the importance of logos. That is, that God, the creator, and his creation are rational and ordered, and that all people can come to know the truth, including the revealed truth, through natural reason. He has stated quite adamantly that without logos, the West is lost. In the next 40 minutes or so, he will hopefully explain to us why he believes this is so and what Western civilization can do about it. I invite you all to participate actively in this masterclass with open heart and mind, and send us your questions through the chat. Let me now say a few things about Dr. Samuel Gregg. Dr. Gregg is a research director at Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He obtained his doctoral degree in moral philosophy and political philosophy from the University of Oxford. He writes and speaks knowledgeably on topics related to political economy, economic history, ethics in finance, and natural law theory. He is the author of 13 books, including The Commercial Society, Becoming Europe, and For God and Profit. In 2019, he published Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization, which is now also available in Spanish. In 2001, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a member of the Mont Pelerin Society in 2004. In 2008, he was elected a member of the Philadelphia Society, where he served as president the past year. You should also know that Sam was born in Tasmania, Australia, attended university in England, and as of 2001, lives and works in the United States. He is the proud husband of historian Ingrid Gregg and has a beautiful daughter named Madeline. The microphone is all yours, Dr. Gregg.
Well, thank you, Carol. It is a pleasure to be here with you for this masterclass at Francisco Marroquin University. Francisco Marroquin University is one of my favorite institutions. I only wish I was doing this presentation live in Guatemala. Fortunately, we have things like Zoom technology, which enable us to talk about some of the things we're going to be discussing in the current forum that we have today. So it is a great pleasure to speak to you all about my new book, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. I have to say, I have been very pleasantly surprised at the attention that the book has received. And as a convinced free marketer on economic questions, I'm compelled to mention that the book is available on Amazon.com in English at the very reasonable price of $20. And it is also available now as of 2 months ago in Spanish. Now, as the book's rather broad title suggests, it's concerned with some very general themes: reason and faith, rationality and religion, and how the relationship between these two dimensions of knowledge have helped to make the West different from the rest. But it's also about how disorders in the relationship between reason and faith have done and continue to do enormous damage to Western societies. The very first thing that I say in the book is that the topic has long occupied my mind, in fact, for more than 14 years. And over that period, nothing has changed my view that the primary challenge facing what I and many others call the West is neither political nor economic. Economics and politics matter. But I've become even more convinced that the most important questions facing Western societies logically precede these topics and in many respects predetermine how we address them. The ways in which the relationship between reason and faith the way that this has shaped the West, for better and for worse, are in many respects subterranean. Occasionally, however, they thrust themselves directly into our view. One such manifestation has been the religiously motivated violence that many Western countries have confronted over the past 20 years. But my book also shows that the far greater bloodshed of the 20th century's darkest decades, carried out at the behest of ideologies that hardly need to be named, owed a great deal to what I call, after Joseph Ratzinger, pathologies of reason and pathologies of faith. Now, fortunately, there's much more to this story than just the ways in which Western societies become unmoored whenever reason and faith start to drift away from each other. One of my arguments is that not only can reason and faith correct each other's excesses, but they can also enhance each other's comprehension of the truth, thereby renewing Western civilization. Another theme of this book, one which I know is controversial for some people, is that the various movements of ideas and persons which we often group together under that catch-all term, the Enlightenment, need not be perpetually at odds with what I regard as the religions of the West. It's not a question of ignoring tensions. Tensions abound, and I highlight many of these tensions throughout my book. But the ideas that began emerging towards the end of the 17th century are, I would argue, inexplicable without the background of the Jewish and Christian cultures out of which the Enlightenment arose. Likewise, I think that more than a few of the freedoms and achievements now embraced by believing Jews and Christians would, I think, have struggled to see the light of day without the efforts of certain Enlightenment thinkers. Now, there are many parts of the book that I could highlight to you today, but as our time is limited, I'm going to focus on just one of these themes. And that is the relationship between what I call the religious faiths of the West and that broad movement of ideas which created so much of the world in which we live today. That movement we call the Enlightenment. So the title of my brief remarks this evening, to give you a sense of what I have in mind, is From Logos to Enlightenment and Back Again. So many of the ongoing tensions that permeate modern Western societies come back, I believe, to two things. The first is an uneasiness among many people of faith about the Enlightenment project. The second is skepticism about religion among those who regard themselves to be the heirs of the various Enlightenments. Let me give you an example. It's my view that Christianity has still not really come to grips with the full implications of the economic revolution launched by the Scottish Enlightenment's greatest and most enduring monument, that is, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Many contemporary Christian thinkers and leaders, I would argue, have tended to marginalize or even ignore many of Adam Smith's key and empirically valid insights. There are many reasons for this, but one reason I think is the fact that much of the Christian world is still struggling 300 years later to deal with many of the ideas and consequences of the Enlightenment. Some people of faith, I would argue, basically see the whole Enlightenment experience as something to be rejected, as being at the root of the West's deepest problems. Other people of faith, by contrast, seem frankly subservient to anyone or anything which claims the mantle of being modern, of being enlightened. But that too, in a way, also betrays an inability to come to grips with the Enlightenment phenomena. On the other side, many self-described modern people in the West plainly regard religion as obscure, repressive, as something that humanity will eventually liberate itself from. Religion is considered an avatar of a world in which things were simply accepted on the basis of authority, often coercive authority, and at odds with the natural and social sciences. Now, there are, to my mind, two difficulties characterizing all these trends. The first, I think, is that they overestimate the break which the Enlightenment made with the pre-modern world. But second, this mindset embodies a major blind spot. And that blind spot is just how seriously the faiths of the West have taken reason, the ways in which these religions liberated the pagan world from irrationality and superstition, and how Judaism and Christianity gave impetus to the seriousness with which the West has taken reason. Now, the rise of reason in the West is often associated with Greece and Rome, and to be sure, many of the roots of, for example, the natural sciences go back to figures like Plato. But one of the central contentions of my book is that the real revolution of reason doesn't begin with the Greeks. It begins, I argue, with the Jewish people. Indeed, I would say, without the Hebrew prophets, there is no Western civilization. When we read, for example, the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, it's very clear that on one level, the Israelites rejected pagan idolatry because the one God had commanded them not to worship other gods. But the Hebrews' hostility to idolatry also reflected their radically different conception of God and God's relationship to the material world. Before anyone else, the Jews came to the realization that the entities worshipped by Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, and Romans were not what these peoples proclaimed them to be. To ascribe divinity to physical elements like water was literally nonsense for the Jews. To this extent, Judaism's confrontation of pagan mythology was a powerful affirmation of human rationality. Because when the Hebrew prophets rebuked pagan idolatry, they were doing something strictly reasonable. It's on these grounds that I would argue that the Jews' liberation of human reason from mythology and nature worship amounted to one of humanity's most powerful enlightenments. The Hebrew prophets were not philosophers, as the Greeks understood this term, but they did play a major role in opening the human mind to objective reality. So why does this matter? It matters because one of the obstacles which inhibited the Greek mind's ability to make sense of reality were the pagan religions that dominated the ancient world. All the pagan religions, without exception, promoted the idea that humans and the human world were ultimately at the mercy of some deeply unpleasant, very fickle deities. That belief gave rise to an enormous intellectual problem. How could a universe of selfish, irrational deities be reconciled with some of the great insights into reality achieved by Greek philosophers? How does a world in which these restless gods were seen as projections and embodiments of nature, how could that be reconciled with Aristotle's claim that humans could discern the laws of nature by studying physical phenomena, or Archimedes' mathematics, or with Plato's insistence that there must be some type of first cause, a rational creator with which everything else begins? Now, what changed this situation was, of course, Christianity. Christianity's belief that the God first revealed to the Jews was a God who loved humanity so much that he entered directly into history to redeem humanity was a remarkably attractive alternative to the likes of Zeus and Venus. But there was something else underscored by the new religion. This something else, derived directly from Judaism, was that God had a rational and creative nature. This theme was powerfully expressed in the opening words of the Gospel of John. This took the first verse of Genesis, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," and adapted it to, "In the beginning was the Word." In Greek, "In the beginning was the Logos." To Greeks, Romans, and diaspora Jews, audiences who were deeply familiar with the language of Logos, these words made the point that the Christian God was not irrational. On the contrary, while he was love, he was also divine reason, Logos, in all its fullness. This Logos had created the world, infused the world and the human race with order, and had written the reasonability which is integral to Logos into the being, man, made in God's image. Now, such a faith was very attractive to many Greeks and Romans who were rightly proud of their intellectual and cultural accomplishments. In Christianity, they found a faith that respected many of their successes, but also reconciled them with the idea of a rational creator in ways that paganism never could. So Christianity's integration of what might be called the Greek Enlightenment into Judaism's unique religious achievement set the pagan religions that had blurred the horizons of the Greco-Roman world on the path to extinction. People saw that religion should be concerned with the truth about reality and therefore ought to be compatible with reason. The result was a civilizational platform that Greek and Roman philosophers could not have constructed on their own. It's this synthesis of reason and faith achieved by the religions of the West, which I argue is core to the identity of the West. It underlines the commitment to reasoned inquiry into truth that is another of the central features of Western culture. It is also crucial to another characteristic Western theme, which is that of liberty. And not just liberty in the sense of an absence of unreasonable coercion, but also liberty in the sense of the self-mastery, which humans freely achieve when they freely choose virtue and flourishing instead of vice and decadence. So the West's integration of reason and faith also helps to explain why universities arose in the medieval period, why we saw the natural sciences develop the way they did in the West, and why 13th century Christian theologians like Albertus Magnus underscored the importance of observation, of experimentation, and of what we call data. It is why medieval Jewish scholars living in the West, such as Levi ben Gerson, became mathematicians of such stature that Christian bishops would consult them about mathematical problems. The same concern for reason meant that the West was able to easily absorb advances in knowledge which began entering Europe from the Muslim world in the 10th century, in areas ranging from mathematics to optics. It's in this light that we realize that the usual story, that the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, the scientific method, progress, improvement, liberty from superstition, etc., marks a radical rupture from the pre-Enlightenment world, we start to realize that this is not a very plausible story. Take, for instance, the publication of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica on the 5th of July, 1687. In many ways, this book proved decisive for the Western world, stating basic hypotheses from which an astounding range of calculations could be developed. The Principia represented a revolution in the natural sciences. Nature's secrets, it seemed, had not only been unlocked, they had also become quantifiable. Now, as we all know, Newton is widely regarded as the hero of Enlightenment. Rather less attention is paid to the fact that Newton was a devout Christian. One reason Newton wrote the Principia was to refute what he regarded as the materialist premises underlying René Descartes' theory of planetary movements. For Newton, God was far more than a clockmaker. Newton's God was a creator who had called the world into being and was intimately involved with that same world all the time. Newton's creator was the God of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures and the pre-existent logos, the rational force within the universe. Impatient with those who mocked religion, Newton held that God had revealed in the scriptures much about himself and the world that humans would not otherwise know. Newton was as impressed with the learning of the Hebrew prophets as he was with Greek thinkers. Now, there were, however, two critical differences introduced by the Enlightenment. The first was an emphasis upon applying reason to man's habits, customs, and traditions to assess whether these habits, customs, and traditions contributed to human well-being or whether they were masks for oppression. Nothing, Enlightenment thinkers believed, should be exempted from the application of critical reason, and that included religion. The second difference was the development of highly specialized ways of thinking. It's in the 18th century that very distinct branches of science started to emerge. What had once been grouped together under what was called natural philosophy was gradually separated into specialized disciplines like biology or zoology. We see similar developments with the emergence of social sciences, topics like politics, morality, and economics, which had hitherto been grouped together under the title natural jurisprudence, began to be studied separately. Now, the benefits of this approach can be absorbed all around us today. Enlightenment thinkers working in the natural and social sciences spurred forward enormous advances in economic development, in our ability to cure diseases, to diminish poverty, to prolong human life, and to grow in our understanding and mastery of the natural world. It's also true that many Enlightenment thinkers and their way of studying the world alerted more and more people to genuine injustices existing in the world. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, for example, showed how the then dominant mercantile system was not only inefficient in creating wealth, it also highlighted how mercantilism involved widespread denial of economic freedom, fostered rampant corruption, and privileged those with political power at everyone else's expense. Would insights like these, which have helped make the world more materially prosperous, economically freer, more creative, and physically healthier, would they have occurred without the type of thinking fostered by the Enlightenment? While we can never definitively answer such questions, I have my doubts. Are the economic and scientific achievements fostered by particular Enlightenment thinkers something that today's religious believers would want to do without? I don't think so. Would we not want to have the benefits of Smith's insights into economics, of Montesquieu's approach to politics, or Locke's contributions to religious liberty? Would we want to do without those things? I don't think so. Now, the flip side to all these positive developments is the darker side of aspects of Enlightenment thought. They include, I'd suggest, the growing absolutization of the scientific method, a tendency to limit rationality to the empirical, a collapse of the specialization of knowledge into a fragmentation of knowledge, the belief that human nature itself can be altered through science or power, the development of ideological projects fostered by intellectuals who want to redesign society from the top down, and efforts to fill the void left by religion's marginalization with utopias, socialist utopias, Marxist utopias, fascist utopias, and now, as we see today, environmentalist utopias. Then there is the way that the same trends have aided and abetted religion's relegation to the realm of preference, of feelings, of subjectivity. One side effect of the scientific triumphs flowing from the Enlightenment was that some people began treating the empirical sciences as the only form of true reason and the primary way to discern true knowledge. But if reason is reduced to the scientific, to the empirical, then reason's ability to contemplate religious questions and philosophical questions becomes radically undermined. And when religion is relegated to the realm of subjectivity, to the realm of emotions, it means that God's nature cannot really be logos. And when that happens, we're left with one of two things. Either God is pure will, who we must obey blindly, even if he commands us to do terrible things, or God is a celestial teddy bear, a being who never warns us, never corrects us, never acts unjustly towards us, who does nothing but affirm us, no matter how irresponsible or stupid or evil our actions may be. Now, the things of which I'm speaking to you tonight are not the stuff of everyday political discourse or debates about economic policy. They don't even feature significantly in what passes for high-level cultural discussions today. But the stakes are very high for the West. Why? Because it's very clear that the integration of reason and faith, which is core to the West's identity, has, I would suggest, broken down, perhaps especially among intellectuals and the shapers of culture, and somehow that integration needs to be restored. But let's be clear, there's no going back to a pre-Enlightenment world. And yet, we need not settle for a civilization that marginalizes the faith of the West in the name of reason and science. So what do we do? How do we bring the world of Adam Smith, of Montesquieu, of Locke, of the American founding, of the Glorious Revolution, of the Wealth of Nations? How do we bring that world, what was called the Republic of Letters, how do we bring it back into a constructive contact, a constructive dialogue with the world of the faiths of the West? Now, to my mind, there are two tasks that have to be undertaken. One is historical, the second is more philosophical. When I say historical, I mean we have to correct the historical record. We have to refute the myth the various enlightenments were uniformly hostile to religion, and that the faiths of the West were somehow opposed to everything associated with the Enlightenment. The good news is that there is already much scholarly work underway in this area. Over the past 90 years, many scholars have illustrated that, quote, only a small fraction of Enlightenment thinkers were anti-religious. The overwhelming majority were interested in finding a balanced relationship between reason and faith, end quote. Enlightenment thinkers remained intensely interested in religious questions, and not necessarily from a hostile standpoint. Even those working in as scientific a field like geology in the 18th century did not set out with the intention of eliminating God from natural history. Instead, they searched for the regular natural laws that God had set in motion at the beginning of time. God continued to be understood in the Enlightenment period as working directly in history, but also, as Newton suggested, in impersonal, secondary ways observable by human beings, much as St. Paul had explained in his letter to the Romans. When it comes to specific religious traditions, the Catholic Church is often perceived as the Enlightenment's great opponent. Now, no doubt that was true in some cases, but plenty of 18th century believing Catholics, from laymen and laywomen to bishops, combined constructive reflection on Enlightenment ideas with loyalty to Rome. Many Catholics supported Enlightenment-inspired political and economic reforms without compromising their religious beliefs. Openness to the new learning can be seen in the willingness of Catholic missionaries to promote practices such as vaccination. 18th century Jesuits even introduced the writings of decidedly non-Catholic thinkers like John Locke and Benjamin Franklin into Spanish colonial America, alongside curricula stressing the natural sciences. In North America, prominent Catholics like the Carroll family, religiously devout and well-read in Enlightenment thought, supported the American Revolution and the subsequent experiment in Republican government. In Protestant Europe, openness to the new learning was perhaps even greater. The most famous example, of course, is the Scottish Enlightenment. A very large proportion of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, the Reverend Francis Hutcheson, the Reverend William Robinson, the Reverend Hugh Blair, the Reverend Adam Ferguson, the Reverend Thomas Reid. All these thinkers combined Protestant Christian faith with a deep interest in Enlightenment approaches to subjects ranging from history to philosophy. The same men insisted that the best of the new learning was compatible with Christianity. We also find considerable receptiveness to Enlightenment ideas among 18th century European Jews, who also did not think that this compromised their religious beliefs. As prominent an 18th century Jewish mind as Moses Mendelssohn regarded Enlightenment thought as crucial for, quote, putting key elements of Jewish metaphysics, such as the existence of God, creation, and the soul's immortality, quote, on a firm philosophical basis. Mendelssohn even credited Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Leibniz with helping him to overcome religious doubts in his youth. He also regarded Enlightenment emphases on God's goodness as one of God's preeminent attributes and as a recovery of, quote, a fundamental insight that biblical and rabbinical Judaism first asserted against the pagan religions. I could go on, and I do go on in my book. But I stress this historical side because I've always thought you cannot have a clear debate about the present unless we have a clear understanding of the past. Now, my second suggestion concerns the need for religious believers to insist that they take reason just as seriously, if not more seriously, than those who consider themselves contemporary representatives of the Enlightenment. And that, above all, concerns a renewed reflection upon God's nature, his nature as love, his nature as mercy, and above all, his nature as logos. Now, there is a risk. There is a risk to re-emphasizing God's nature as logos. There have been occasions in the past when Christians, for example, have drifted in the direction of hyper-rationalism. We saw this, for example, with some medieval scholastics. But hyper-rationalism is hardly the problem facing the religions of the West today. On the contrary, I think a very real problem confronting the two faiths of the West is the rampant sentimentalism in which so many religious organizations, synagogues, and churches in the West are presently drowning. Because when you separate faith from reason, many pathologies of faith and reason develop, and I examine many of these in my book. One such pathology is fideism, which is blind obedience and a type of suspicion of reason. But another pathology is sentimentalism, when faith becomes seen as primarily about the realm of feelings, of emotions, and even of unreason. In this world, attention to logic, to coherence of thought, to evidence, to things as basic to human reasoning, such as the principle of non-contradiction, become dismissed as rigidity of thought. Hence, we end up with absurdities, such as clergy trying to tell us that 2 times 2 can sometimes equal 5, or not. For who are we to assume that God will not betray his own nature as Logos? And seen from this standpoint, the fideist and the sentimentalist certainly have one thing in common. Neither regards God as having the characteristics of Logos. What's also clear is that the sentimentalism presently infecting wide swathes of Judaism and Christianity in the West is all about diminishing the gravity, clarity, and seriousness of faith. The God fully revealed in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures is certainly merciful, but he's also just. And he's just, which means that he is reasonable and very clear in his expectations of us because he takes us seriously. Woe to us if we don't return the compliment. Now, our return to emphasizing God as divine reason isn't about us downgrading the importance of emotions like love and joy, anger and fear. We are not robots. Feelings are central aspects of our nature and they give us insights into reality. But human emotions and human experiences do need to be integrated into a coherent account of faith, human reason, human action, human free choice, and human flourishing. And then we need to live our lives accordingly. This return to Logos that I'm advocating isn't, however, just about restoring inner coherence to the proclamation and practice of faith. It is also about helping the world bequeath to the West by the Enlightenment to understand that human reason can't come from nowhere, that being can't come from nothingness, and something can't come from a void. As the Nobel economist Vernon Smith observed in a 2016 lecture about religion and science, he said this, quote, "What is inescapable is the dependence of science on faith." Now, by faith, Vernon Smith has in mind Paul's definition, the quote, "substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Just as the natural sciences, which are so rightly prized by the Enlightenment, cannot arise from irrationality, nor can human reason arise out of nothingness. We may not yet see it face to face, but in the beginning, there must have been the Logos. It's this commitment to the full-bodied reason that includes, but also transcends, empirical reason that matters. But that commitment to reason in turn depends on the recognition that if there is a God, and whether we call him first cause, Yahweh Sabaoth, Christos, Panokrator, divine providence, or supreme being, this being must be the Logos. Logos whose rationality and liberty are reflected in our reason and our ability to choose freely to know and live in the truth. Without this commitment to Logos, I'm afraid, the West is lost. But I do not believe that decline is inevitable. I say that again, there is nothing inevitable about the fate of the West. Why? Because the free choice for Logos, and thus for reason and faith, is never beyond us. The desire for truth, for liberty, and for justice is simply part of who we are. To give rational form to these human longings is thus to act in a way which is truly enlightening, fully consonant with the faiths of the West, and it is to build a future for the West, firmly grounded on the sure knowledge that it is the truth, the Logos himself, who sets us free. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was wonderful. We have a few questions from the audience, and I would now like to invite our listeners to formulate some more questions. We have a question from Carlos Omar Gil. He asks, what has been the impact of Enlightenment philosophy so far in modern Latin American thought? And would you kindly recommend a few books to further study this?
Well, thank you for that question. In my book, I actually mention the impact of different Enlightenment thinkers upon 18th century Portuguese and Spanish colonial America. There was a Spanish Enlightenment, there was a Portuguese Enlightenment. Some of it was highly marked by anti-clericalism, but in other cases, it was less to do with anti-clericalism and much more to do with the institutional power of the church and the desire to give, to essentially remove the church from active involvement in the temporal realm. So there's certainly that dimension to it. And this had an impact upon colonial Latin America. It's also true, as I mentioned in my remarks, that religious orders, ranging from the Franciscans to the Jesuits, who were very active, of course, as you know better than I, in Latin America in the 18th century, sometimes as missionaries, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as people lecturing in university-like or college settings. These Catholic missionaries brought Enlightenment authored books to Latin America and introduced them into the formal instruction that went on in many Latin American institutions. I mentioned, for example, Jesuit missionaries putting the works of John Locke, but also people like Benjamin Franklin into the curriculum of what was being taught in Jesuit schools and colleges throughout Latin America. We also know that they were very attentive to the work of people such as Sir Isaac Newton. So you do see this tendency on the part of many Catholics in Latin America, educated Catholics, and for the most part that they were clergy, of course, consciously trying to integrate what was called the new learning into the set curriculum that existed at the time. And they weren't particularly worried if the authors of these books were Protestants. They weren't particularly worried if the authors of these books were even skeptics. After all, they were using books written by pagans. So the logic was, well, we're using books written by pagans. Why can't we use selectively some of the books that are being written by some of these Enlightenment thinkers? So a good book to read on this subject, it's by a German historian who's now teaching at the University of Notre Dame. His name is Ulrich Lerner, L-E-H-R-E-R. And the book is called The Catholic Enlightenment. And he spends a number of sections of the book talking about the impact of Enlightenment thought in the Catholic world in Latin America. I should also mention, of course, that it's well known that much Enlightenment thought in continental, but particularly in continental Europe, was also associated with Freemasonry. And Freemasonry has a very, how shall I put this, a very difficult history when it comes to its relationship with the Catholic Church. And there was certainly Freemasonry present in much of Latin America in the 18th century and the 19th century. Some of this had a strong anti-Catholic dimension. Other aspects of it had a more neutral view of Catholicism. So there is that other dimension to the impact of Enlightenment thought upon Latin America. I should also mention that when it came to some of the liberation movements, liberation from Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, it's very clear that a number of the people who were involved in those movements were highly influenced by the French Revolution, by the rhetoric of the French Revolution, by reading different Enlightenment thinkers. But it's also true that many of the people who are heavily involved in the efforts to acquire independence from Spain and Portugal, many of them were also deeply devout Catholics. So my point is this, and this theme goes through the whole book. There's a tendency to view the Enlightenment and religion as being perpetually at odds. And when you look at the history, the actual history of this, whether it's in the context of continental Europe, whether it's in North America, or whether it's in Latin America, we see that the relationship is much more complicated than we realize. We should not assume that it's all about hostility. Yes, there is conflict. Yes, there are tensions, but we shouldn't assume that that is the whole story of the relationship between religion and the Enlightenment, whether it's in continental Europe or throughout the former Spanish and Portuguese colonies of Latin America.
That ties into this other question. What do you mean by human flourishing? Mm-hmm. Because in a way, Latin America is part of the West, but for some reason, we have not flourished in the way that Anglo-Saxon countries did.
Well, of course, I'm very conscious, Carol, that you are widely known as the Anglo-Saxon of Guatemala. But what I will say is this, a couple of things. First of all, the characteristic way in which Enlightenment thinkers talked about this idea of human flourishing, the phrase they used was improvement. They talked about improvement all the time. Now, what they meant by that was improvement in the empirical and natural sciences, and using the empirical and natural sciences, whether it's things like physics, or which is a natural science, or whether it's using something like economics, which of course is a social science, using these things to improve the world around us. So the natural world by making more use of the natural world, of using the scientific method to improve things like human health, human well-being, longevity of life, etc. Now, it's important to understand that Catholics and Protestants were not opposed to this. This was not seen as a problem. In fact, some of the most basic elements of the natural sciences, for example, were first worked out in the medieval period. So that it wasn't seen as being contradictory. What the Enlightenment did was focus more upon the way in which use of the natural and social sciences could be used to improve the natural world, and let's call it the material conditions of human existence and our knowledge of the natural world around us, and also an empirical understanding of human society, which is very much what, for example, economics is all about. So I think that's important to understand. The second thing I want to say, and I perhaps did not talk about this as much as I should have in my lecture, is that we often talk about the Enlightenment as if it's one single movement in time. And any historian of the Enlightenment will tell you that that's simply not true. There are many different forms of, many different expressions of this Enlightenment movement. You have the French Enlightenment. You have an early French Enlightenment and you have a later French Enlightenment. You have a German Enlightenment associated with people like Kant, for example. You have an Italian Enlightenment. You have a Russian Enlightenment. You even have an Irish Enlightenment, believe it or not. But there's also, of course, I think, in my mind, the most important Enlightenment movement of all was the Scottish Enlightenment, which is a very, very different phenomena than, for example, the late French Enlightenment. The late French Enlightenment, highly characterized by the thought of people like Rousseau and Voltaire, both of whom were quite anti-religious. And in the case of Voltaire, he was really interested in moving society away from an embrace of trade and commerce because he thought these things corrupted people. That's very different from the Scottish Enlightenment, which had a very positive view of trade and commerce, and which, as I mentioned during my remarks, had a very generally a positive view of religion. Yes, there were people like David Hume who were clearly, he's clearly an atheist, at a minimum a skeptic, probably an atheist. But that's not characteristic of most Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. It's a very different type of Enlightenment experience. Now, how does this play into your question? It plays into your question because different Enlightenments had different types of effects upon different parts of the world. So in North America, the Enlightenment which had the most impact was the Scottish Enlightenment. And this was very concerned with issues of trade, of commerce, of spreading the blessings of liberty, of trying to understand the foundations of law, and was not anti-religious. It's not anti-religious. And in fact, if you look at the American Enlightenment, you discover very quickly that it's a very religion-friendly movement, and that many of the people involved in the American Enlightenment, a disproportionate number of them were Protestant ministers. So I think that, and it's very much an Enlightenment which focused upon building things from the bottom up, which is also very characteristic of certain forms of Protestant Christianity. In the case of much of Latin America, what I think has had more impact than the Scottish Enlightenment has been late French Enlightenment thinking. And that has a very top-down approach towards social order. It's not a coincidence that many late French Enlightenment thinkers were very favorable to absolutist forms of government. We often think of French Enlightenment thinkers as being proto-democrats. Not at all. They were very much looking for the ideal absolutist ruler who would simply implement everything for them. So I think in the case of much of Latin America, not all, much of Latin America, what you see in terms of the Enlightenment is a type of a reinforcement of this top-down mentality of centralization of power, which is very characteristic of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, and the type of Enlightenment thinking that manifested itself in much of Latin America complemented some of these older traditions of centralized, absolute, top-down control. Now, that's obviously not the entire explanation for why North America has developed in different ways from Latin America. But I think it is part of the story. And it's one of the reasons why whenever I'm in Latin America, I'm always telling people, including people who are religious believers, I always say, there are more than one Enlightenment. And it's worth getting to know the Scottish Enlightenment because it's very, very different from the French Enlightenment, from which you are probably more familiar with.
Thank you, Sam. We have another question here from Ana Uruela. She asks, there are mysteries in the Christian faith that human reason cannot explain. How do you reconcile these mysteries with the reason that God has given us? And how does the balance look between faith and reason?
Sure. Well, the way I typically answer that question, which is a question that I get in many different forums from believers and unbelievers and non-believers alike, is to say this: a mystery is not something that's completely incomprehensible to us. A mystery is something that we understand aspects of, but we don't understand everything. So a good example would be something like the dogma of the Trinity, which is the classic Christian dogma of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. I think it was Cardinal Newman who said, well, that tells us some things. This is a mystery, but we do know certain things about it. We know that God is the Father, God is the Son, and God is the Holy Spirit. That tells us that the Father is not the Son is not the Father, the Spirit is not the Son, etc. That they're not exactly the same, but they are also the same. It also tells us that God has manifested himself in three persons. So we know that. These are things that we know. We know these things. There are certain truths that are built into these things that are recognizable to us. Now, we don't know everything about the dogma of the Trinity, but we do know some things. We do know it does tell us something about the nature of God. It doesn't tell us the full picture, but it's our reason working on the basis of what has been revealed to us in the scriptures, in Revelation, in God's full revelation over time. But what Christians believe begins with the Jewish people and is consummated and finalized in the person, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we know a lot about these things, and we use our reason to try and understand many of these things, knowing that we're not going to understand everything about it. So that's an example of where reason and faith are working together. And remember, St. Augustine, a figure who's greatly respected by Catholics, by Protestants, by Eastern Orthodox, he tells us, he says, an act of faith is in a sense an act of reason, because our faith, the choice for faith, presumes that we have accepted as true, that our reason has judged to be true, and therefore we are willing to say that, well, in addition to what I know is true, I'm going to accept that these other truths are reliable truths because they are coming from the same source. So this is an example where reason and faith are constantly working together, and it achieved a type of hypothesis, at least in the West, I think in the work of Thomas Aquinas. Now that relationship can go wrong in many cases. It goes wrong in the case of sort of the hyper-rationalism I referred to in my lecture. It can go wrong in a type of fideism. I mentioned that in my lecture as well. But at least for the Christian, reason and faith are working together. They're not seen as being inherently contradictory. And it's through reason that we can explicate and explain aspects of these mysteries. Now, I want to caution, there's one caution I want to make. I am not denying, I would never deny, that many people come to religious faith through some type of experience. There are plenty of examples in history of individuals, very, very smart, highly intellectual individuals, someone like, again, I'll use the example of St. Augustine, right? One of the smartest people ever to walk the face of the earth, but who could not bring himself to believe. He acknowledged, he would say things like, the pagan religions are nonsense, I accept that. I accept the Manichaeans are wrong. I accept that Gnosticism is wrong. I see all these things as wrong, but I can't quite make the leap to Christian faith. And what caused him to make the leap? Ultimately, it was his experience of being in the garden and being told, hearing a child's voice saying, take and read. And he picks up the scriptures and reads that famous passage in the scriptures. That's a religious experience. That is what changed him from being a questioner to being a religious believer. So I would never say that people can only reason themselves into faith. I know people like that, but I also greatly respect the truth that many people have a religious experience that makes them a religious believer. That experience is not contradictory to having a robust view, a very strong view about how reason and faith work together.
Here from Jesus Maria. He says, dear professor, extraordinary conference. And he has 3 questions.
Oh,
and
great.
I think I'll read them all because in a way you've already answered parts of some of them. Okay, so the first question is, if faith and reason are the core of Western civilization, how do we reverse the animosity against reason and faith in the universities?
Mm-hmm.
That's number 1. The second question is, you say that the core of Western civilization is faith and reason. But how to reconcile faith and reason in countries like Latin America, where faith has been considered irrational or against modernity, which in a way you've already addressed. And then the third question is, can you make a conceptual distinction between the Scottish illustration, unknown in Latin America, and the French illustration? In my opinion, the conception of rights is very different in Latin America than in the United States and the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Well, you're correct. I have already answered some of these questions, but I'll expand a little bit for each 3. So how do we reverse the animosity in the universities that exists between faith and reason? Well, I think it's incumbent, for example, upon those people who are believers, who are religious believers, who are working in universities, to be able to do what St. Peter says in his letter, where he says, be ready to give an account of what you believe. Be ready to give an argument for why you believe what you believe. Which means that when they encounter when such individuals encounter someone who's a skeptic or someone who's an atheist or someone who's just questioning, that they're able to say, well, I am a person of faith, and I'm a person of faith because I believe it's reasonable to be a believer. In fact, it's more reasonable to be a believer than it is to be a skeptic. So in other words, to be willing to argue on the basis of reason and the claims of reason made by, in this case, the Christian faith, against the claims of the skeptic or the atheist for why they believe they have the more reasonable position. I think in too many cases, many believers who are working in universities shy away from engaging in these types of discussions. It has to be a very respectful discussion, but I don't think they should shy away or avoid those types of discussions when people ask questions. I've been in many situations in universities where I've been giving a lecture on economics and no one particularly knows anything about me, and then someone works out that I'm a Catholic and they start asking me questions. And I have found that starting on the premises of reason is a good way to begin the discussion, because for many people, as I think the question was implied, well, for many people, religion is seen as irrational. Now, there are some expressions of faith that are highly irrational. There are some forms, fideism is, I think, fundamentally an irrational position, whether it manifests itself in Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. But I also think that the claims of the Christian faith to be rational, I think, are very, very defensible. But the person who's the believer needs to be willing to do that. On the same side, for the non-believer, I think it's incumbent for them to ask themselves the question, well, is it true that all expressions of religion are highly irrational or highly emotivist? Now, there are some expressions of religion or faith which are highly emotivist, highly irrational, and do not add up to a coherent explanation of the origins of the world or the way that everything apparently fits together. But I think for the non-believer, I think they need to enter into this discussion by saying, well, maybe I need to accept that whether I'm a believer or not, it's simply incomprehensible to think about the development of the West without acknowledging the indispensable role played by Judaism and Christianity in shaping that, to ask themselves, who was it that first built the universities? It wasn't skeptics, it wasn't atheists, it was religious believers. Religious believers built the universities in the Middle Ages because they thought that truth was important and we needed places where people could devote themselves to the pursuit of truth, and the ultimate truth was knowledge of God, true knowledge of God. So I think that an honest, a sincere non-believer can enter into these discussions if they are willing to accept that not all religions are irrational, emotivist, or fideist. Some are, but not all are. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is related to the Latin American question. If I had one way of thinking about this, one would be to say that it's more, I think, the fact that in many cases, it's been a failure on the part of religious believers, whether they're Roman Catholic or Protestant or Eastern Orthodox, to argue their case, to argue for what they believe to be true about the nature of God and how that has implications for politics, law, and economics, to enter into these arguments on the basis of reason. And again, I don't want to play down the role played by religious culture and religious experience in these things. But it does seem to me that part of the way in Latin America for these things to be resolved is for enough religious believers to say, you know what, we take reason just as seriously as you do. In fact, that is a common ground, presumably, between the religious believer and the person who's not a religious believer. And to insist that as far as possible, one can engage in these questions on the basis of reason, I think for religious believers to do that, I think would make a major step forward in the way that the relationship between reason and faith is understood in Latin America. So instead of making pseudo-fideistic claims or statements that they approach these things by saying, well, I am a believer because I believe that the Christian faith is true, and I believe it's true because I think it's reasonable, and I think it's reasonable to believe all these particular things that Christianity proclaims. I think that's one way. Now, this question of the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment, many differences, obviously, especially the late French Enlightenment. I mentioned some of them before: the top-down approach, the sympathy towards absolutism, the hostility towards religion, which in many cases assumed mockery rather than serious intellectual critique. And in the Scottish Enlightenment, you see a very different phenomenon happening. You also see, I think, with this reference to this language of rights, is that at least in the Scottish Enlightenment, there's still a very strong influence of what's called natural law philosophy in Scottish Enlightenment thinking. A very good example of this is Adam Smith's tutor, Francis Hutcheson, who wrote a great deal about natural law, and he also wrote about natural rights as well. He firmly rooted natural rights in natural law. So natural law claims led to natural law rights. You find that in many Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. So for them, the language of rights was derived from reflection upon natural law, which means reason's apprehension of moral truth and philosophical truth. That's what natural law is about. And it was on that basis that they identified a small number of things as rights. Rights in the sense of obligations that we owe other people, rights to our lives, rights to our property, rights to certain freedoms, etc., etc. And that was reflected in legal systems that developed in North America and England and Scotland. It's very different, however, to the way that rights were understood in the context of the French Enlightenment. Rights tended to be seen as things that arising from what was called the laws of nature. And that's not the same thing as natural law. By the laws of nature, what they generally meant was a type of empirical verification, that, well, we have private property because it works. It seems efficient. And that's true. Private property does work. It is efficient, but it doesn't lead to a philosophical rights claim. Whereas in the context of the Scottish Enlightenment, because of this natural law heritage, which was never abandoned by lots of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, they were much better at articulating concepts of rights that were grounded in things other than efficiency and effectiveness. So to the extent that Latin America experienced much more of that particular late French Enlightenment way of thinking about rights, we shouldn't be surprised that it manifested itself in a very different way to what we found in places like North America and other countries that were highly influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment.
Thank you very much. You have studied the work of Pope Benedict XVI or Joseph Ratzinger very carefully. Why do you find his work so compelling?
Well, for a couple of reasons. I could give a whole lecture on the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, but I'll refrain from tonight. What I will say is this. Joseph Ratzinger is often seen as a type of, he's often portrayed, falsely, I think, as a type of reactionary figure, a type of hyper-conservative figure. Yeah. But when you read his works, I don't just mean his reflections when he was Pope, but when you read his writings as a theologian, when you read his writings as someone who's thinking about philosophical questions, it's very interesting to me that he typically does not begin with the Bible. He typically does not begin with great Christian minds like Calvin or Augustine or Aquinas or Luther. He doesn't begin with any of these people. His most common reference point, and this is something that I realized about 15 years ago. He typically starts with Enlightenment thought. That's his typical place for beginning reflection. And that's very unusual for a man of his generation. I still think it's relatively unusual today for a Christian theologian and a Christian philosopher who takes obviously the claims of faith very seriously. He will often tell you that his most favorite thinker is Augustine. But when he engages religious and philosophical questions, he typically begins with Enlightenment thinkers and Enlightenment reference points. So he is one of these people who you don't have to explain to him the difference between the Anglo-Saxon Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. He knows it. He already knows it. He has also said that there are many aspects of Enlightenment thought which he thinks have been extremely beneficial. He says, for example, would we have arrived at the type of conception of religious liberty that exists today if it wasn't for Enlightenment thinkers? He's not sure we would. He's not sure we would. When you go back and you read his reflections about the relationship between religion and science, it's very apparent that he's read the writings of people like Heisenberg and Einstein. So these are people who are Nobel scientists who have thought very seriously about these questions, but who also thought very seriously about religious questions. So this is one of the reasons I find his thought particularly attractive. He starts with modernity. He looks around the modern world and says, what is good about this modern world? And there's many good things about this modern world. I'm very glad I live in a world in which we have modern dentistry. I really am. But he looks around the world and says, these are the good things that the Enlightenment movements have given us. They've given us longer lifespans. They've made economic progress possible in a way that was incomprehensible up until around about 3 centuries ago. It has developed mature forms of limited government and constitutionalism, notions of rights, which are very important. So the fact that he takes the Enlightenment's genuine achievements seriously, I think, is a way for those people interested in these discussions to enter into these discussions by saying, well, this is a thinker who has reflected long and hard about some of these relationships between the pre-modern world and the modern world. And he sees good in the modern world and he sees problems in the modern world, but he also sees good in the pre-modern world, but he also sees problems in the pre-modern world. It's very rare that you find people who are believers who think that way. It's also very rare that you find non-believers who think that way. So those people who may be watching tonight who may not be believers, I would seriously recommend that you pick up some of his books and start reading them. And you'll find that this is a person who himself describes himself as a modern man living in the modern world and who is concerned with understanding the relationship between this modern world and the religious faiths that gave birth to this modern world. Because if you look back, I think that if you look at much of the Enlightenment, what you discover are ways of trying to realize much of the promise that was contained in Christianity and before that in Judaism. So these are just some of the reasons why I think he's a very important thinker when it comes to understanding this relationship between reason and faith. Because for him, the Enlightenment is something that believers need to take more seriously, but he also thinks Enlightenment-influenced people need to move away from caricatures of what religion is actually about.
Thank you, Sam. We're sort of coming to the end, but we have another message here from Jesus Maria. He's saying, "Dear Professor, thank you very much for your answers. When I asked the questions, you read my mind and answered them before I had even asked them. I recently read an article about a book of Burke. You have written on philosophy, economics and law, etc. In this Western core of reason and faith, what challenges does the current economy have, especially after COVID, in synthesis? And we have around 5 minutes.
Well, what can we say about the world of faith and reason in the midst of a pandemic? Well, we can say many things. One thing we can say is that the Enlightenment or aspects of Enlightenment thought and some Enlightenment thinkers held out the promise that humans would achieve a type of mastery over everything. Not just the material world, but even over human nature itself. That we could become like God. Well, things like pandemics, things like particular events or particular occurrences in the course of human history remind us that while the power of reason, including the empirical and social sciences, has given us great command over the world, it's a reminder that we are not, in fact, the master of the universe. And that's an insight which we find confirmation in Revelation, right? Because if you go back to the book of Genesis, what is the error made by the first human beings? The first human beings make the error of believing that they can be like God. They can be like God. And one of the things that things like pandemics remind us of is we are not, in fact, God. Will we get over this? Yes. Will we move forward in history past COVID? I don't have any doubt that we will, but there'll be other challenges that come along. Things that humans thought that they had dispensed with had been relegated to history, but turn out not to have been relegated to history. So things like pandemics, to my mind, are not particularly a challenge in terms of faith for me. In some respects, they're a confirmation of some basic truths revealed, for example, in the scriptures about the relationship between God and man. The other thing which is interesting about the pandemic is that, well, first of all, it reminded us how things like how much we rely upon the empirical and social sciences to deal with all sorts of problems. The very fact that we're having this discussion tonight, here I am in the United States, you're in Guatemala, and many of you are viewing from all sorts of different places in Latin America and around the world. We can do this because we've used our scientific abilities to create these types of platforms. So so pandemics and other things have, they provide occasions for us to learn how to use existing things in new and exciting ways. So it's also, however, confirmed to us, as I said, that we're not masters of the universe, but it's also confirmed to us that we are, in fact, more reliant upon each other than perhaps we realize. We've also, I think, finding that many people are looking at things like pandemics and asking the types of questions that humans naturally ask in these circumstances. How could this happen? Who would do this to us? Well, as it happens, I believe that the faiths of the West provide very good explanations of why we endure these sorts of things, why these things happen, and the role played by human reactions to something like a pandemic and understanding more about the nature of God, more about the power and limits of reason, and more about what's ultimately important in human life as we all make this journey forward together. So I think the thing things about pandemics, things about these, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, all these things, they're not new questions that come up. Humans have been asking these questions for a long time. And I think it's an opportunity for us to realize what reason can do and cannot do in these circumstances, what scientific reason can do in terms of helping us to deal with these circumstances, but also what scientific reason cannot help us deal with in these circumstances. But it also helps us realize that these questions have been asked before, and the faiths of the West, I believe, have very powerful and, to my mind, convincing answers as to why these things happen and how they fit into the wider scheme of things as has been created from the very beginning by the Logos himself. It seems like a good place to end.
Very, very nice. Thank you very much for this wonderful evening. During this masterclass, we traced our steps from Logos to Enlightenment and have tried to find our way back to the once solid foundations of Western culture. I think here are some of the things we learned. We learned that people of faith care about advancing knowledge, and we have found ways to adhere to their religious principles while at the same time advocating for certain Enlightenment ideas and free markets. We learned that Enlightenment has a light and a dark side. We learned that the West must put forth the type of enlightenment that integrates creation, freedom, justice, and faith. We must recommit to full-bodied reason, to logos, not just to empirical reason. We also learned that God is neither a celestial teddy bear who merely affirms us, nor an absolutely whimsical figure who can ask us to act irrationally, but rather he is logos. I think a very important lesson is that we have to correct the historical record. The good news is there is already a lot of scholarly work that illustrates that most Enlightenment thinkers were not opposed to religion and remained interested in religious questions. And we learned that universal moral truth exists and that it can be understood by believers and non-believers alike. So if you're very interested in studying Sam's work in depth, I would like to invite you to a seminar that is organized by Academia Fe y Libertad of the Instituto Fe y Libertad, where, guided by Dr. Samuel Gregg, we will analyze his book, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization over the course of 4 sessions, starting on Tuesday, next Tuesday, August 18th at 6 p.m. Thank you again for tuning in to this masterclass, and thank you very, very much, Dr. Gregg, for your magnificent presentation as always.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Francisco Marroquín is very close to my heart. I've been there a number of times. I wish I was there now. And I look forward to not just doing these sorts of presentations for Fe y Libertad in the next following weeks. I look forward to coming to Francisco Marroquín when we're past this pandemic and we can talk about these things, these very important topics, not virtually, but in person. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.